The United States of America was born from a powerful idea. It was the idea of liberty. The Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal. Yet, from its very beginning, the nation held a deep and troubling contradiction within its soul. While it championed freedom for some, it built its foundation on the bondage of others. Millions of African Americans were held in slavery, their labor stolen, their families torn apart, their humanity denied. This fundamental hypocrisy was a crack in the country's foundation, a fault line that would, over time, widen until the entire structure threatened to collapse upon itself. It was a problem that could not be ignored forever, a moral reckoning that was destined to arrive. By the middle of the 19th century, America was really two different countries sharing a single flag. In the North, society was changing rapidly. Cities grew larger as waves of immigrants arrived from Europe, seeking work and a new life. Factories sprang up, powered by steam and human ingenuity, producing textiles, tools, and all manner of goods. The northern economy was a dynamic industrial engine, built on wage labor and commerce. Life was fast-paced, and the future seemed to point toward even greater industrial growth. This was a world of bustling markets, crowded streets, and a growing belief in the power of free labor, where a person could sell their skills for a wage and improve their station in life. The South, however, was a world apart, seemingly frozen in a different time. Its economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, dominated by vast plantations that grew cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. This entire way of life, from the grand manor houses of the wealthy planters to the smallest rural farms, depended completely on the forced labor of enslaved people. Cotton was king, they said, and slavery was the throne upon which that king sat. Southern culture was deeply traditional, valuing honor, land ownership, and a rigid social hierarchy. It was a society that looked to the past, holding tight to an agrarian ideal that stood in stark contrast to the industrializing, urbanizing North. These profound differences in economy and culture created two distinct mindsets. Northerners increasingly saw the South as a backward, stagnant society, held back by the immoral and inefficient institution of slavery. They believed their future was in manufacturing, trade, and westward expansion powered by free men and women. Southerners, in turn, often viewed the North with suspicion and resentment. They saw it as a place of greedy merchants and chaotic cities, a society that threatened their cherished traditions and, most importantly, their right to own human property. These were not just disagreements, they were fundamentally opposing views of what America was and what it should become. As the nation expanded westward, the question of slavery could no longer be contained. Every time a new territory applied to become a state, a fierce political battle erupted. The central issue was whether the new state would permit slavery or be a free state. This was not just a moral debate, it was a struggle for power in Washington, D.C. The North and South each wanted to maintain a balance in the Senate, ensuring that neither side could dominate the other and pass laws that would harm its interests. The admission of a new state threatened to tip that delicate balance, turning every territorial dispute into a national crisis that pushed the country closer to the brink of disunion. For decades, political leaders tried to stitch the nation together with a series of fragile compromises. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise was a major attempt to solve the problem. It admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state, but also admitted Maine as a free state, preserving the balance of power. It also drew a line across the Louisiana Territory, prohibiting slavery in new territories north of the line. Later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 tried a different approach, allowing settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This idea, known as popular sovereignty, led to disaster, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, leading to a bloody miniature civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. While politicians debated, a powerful moral movement was gaining strength in the North. This was the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists believed that slavery was a profound sin, a moral evil that had to be eradicated from the nation entirely. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a brilliant orator and writer, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin exposed the horrors of slavery to millions, refused to compromise. They argued that there could be no middle ground on human bondage. Their passionate crusade put constant pressure on the political system and forced many ordinary Northerners to confront the brutal reality of the institution their Southern countrymen defended. The South viewed the abolitionists with a mixture of fear and fury. They saw them not as moral crusaders but as dangerous fanatics intent on destroying their entire way of life. They feared that abolitionist rhetoric would incite slave rebellions, leading to widespread violence and the collapse of their social order. In response, Southern leaders began to defend slavery more aggressively than ever before. They argued it was not a necessary evil but a positive good, a beneficial system for both the enslaver and the enslaved. This hardening of positions on both sides made compromise increasingly impossible. The middle ground was vanishing, leaving two societies glaring at each other across a widening moral and political chasm. The presidential election of 1860 brought the long, simmering conflict to a boil. The newly formed Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate. The party's main platform was clear: it opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. While Lincoln himself said he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, his position was utterly unacceptable to the South. For Southern leaders, Lincoln's election represented a catastrophic threat. They believed it was only a matter of time before he and his party would move to abolish slavery everywhere, dismantling their economy, their society, and their entire world. The very thought of a president hostile to their institution was more than they could bear. When Abraham Lincoln won the election without carrying a single Southern state, the reaction was swift and decisive. To the white South, his victory was proof that they had lost all political power in the Union. They felt they were now a permanent minority, whose interests would be ignored and whose way of life would be under constant attack by a hostile federal government. Before Lincoln could even take the oath of office, South Carolina made a momentous decision. On December 20th, 1860, it officially seceded from the United States, declaring that the Union was dissolved. It was a radical act, a final rejection of the American experiment as they had known it. South Carolina's bold move created a domino effect across the Deep South. In the months that followed, 6 other states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, also voted to leave the Union. They saw secession as their only remaining option to protect their rights, particularly the right to own slaves. In February 1861, delegates from these states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They wrote their own constitution, which explicitly protected the institution of slavery, and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The House that was once divided had now broken in two. The nation held its breath. President Lincoln, in his inaugural address in March 1861, pleaded for reconciliation. He insisted that the Union was perpetual and that secession was illegal. "We are not enemies but friends," he urged. "We must not be enemies." But the time for words had passed. The Confederacy had seized federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses within its borders. Only a few remained in Union hands, including a lonely outpost in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. That outpost was named Fort Sumter. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether the United States would survive or shatter into pieces. The standoff at Fort Sumter could not last. The Union soldiers stationed there were running out of supplies, and President Lincoln made the decision to send a ship to resupply them. For the new Confederacy, this was an act of aggression. They saw the fort as a symbol of foreign occupation in their territory. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued until the Union garrison surrendered. Not a single soldier was killed in the exchange, but those cannon shots were the thunderous beginning of the deadliest war in American history. The attack on the fort electrified both the North and the South, turning political division into armed conflict. The war had begun. This war would be different from any that had come before it. It was fought not against a foreign power, but by Americans against Americans, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. It was a total war, demanding the mobilization of entire societies. The new technologies of the industrial age made it incredibly lethal. Railroads moved troops and supplies with unprecedented speed, while the telegraph allowed for near-instant communication. More devastatingly, new weapons like the rifle musket gave infantrymen the ability to fire accurately from hundreds of yards away, turning orderly battlefields into scenes of unimaginable carnage and making old tactics obsolete. At first, the war was fought simply to preserve the Union, to force the seceded states back into the nation. But as the conflict dragged on and the casualty lists grew ever longer, the purpose of the war began to transform. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States were thenceforward and forever free. It was a revolutionary moment. The proclamation turned the Union Army into an army of liberation and redefined the stakes of the conflict. The war was no longer just about preserving the old Union. It was now a fight for a new Union, one without slavery. After 4 long and bloody years, the Confederacy was defeated and the Union was preserved. But the nation that emerged was profoundly changed. The war had cost over 620,000 lives and left vast swaths of the South in ruins. It had also answered 2 fundamental questions that had plagued the nation since its birth. It affirmed that the United States was a single, indivisible nation, not a mere compact of states that could be abandoned at will. And through the crucible of fire and blood, it had finally ended the institution of slavery. The American Civil War was a terrible, tragic, and transformative ordeal, a second American Revolution that gave the nation, in Lincoln's immortal words, a new birth of freedom.